Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our event for today, Beyond COP26, From Discussion to Action. So this is a cross-chamber event. We're working with a coalition of chambers of commerce in Japan, and we're coming to you live today from the German Chamber of Commerce here in central Tokyo. So I'm here with three very distinguished panelists who I will introduce in a moment. But we're going to start off with a video from Naomi Cowan, who is Head of Energy and Climate Change Policy at the British Embassy in Tokyo. So Naomi's going to set the scene for us, talk about her takeaways from COP26, and then we'll dive into the panel discussion from there. So over to Naomi.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Naomi Cowan, and I lead the Climate and Energy team at the British Embassy in Tokyo. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this really important event. I'm delighted that the British Chamber of Commerce Japan and other international chambers of commerce here in Japan have decided to focus on this important issue and to move forward this discussion between members. So, as you know, COP26 took place in November 2021 after 2 years of international engagement by the UK presidency. We very much welcomed the commitments that Japan made at and ahead of COP26, including things like Japan's net zero by 2050 commitment, enhanced 2030 emissions reduction target, generous commitments to climate finance, and on many other areas as well. And it's not just the commitments that came from the Japanese government that we welcome. We also welcome the commitments from Japanese business and industry. Just ahead of COP26, over 60 Japanese companies signed up to the Race to Zero initiative, and we're really pleased to have them all on board. So what happened at COP26? Well, 197 parties, 197 countries, came together and agreed the Glasgow Climate Pact. The Glasgow Climate Pact builds on the Paris Agreement, and it sets the rulebook for the Paris Agreement after 6 years of negotiations. The Glasgow Climate Pact also keeps the 1.5 degree goal alive. So what does that mean? One of the targets for COP26 was to keep this 1.5 goal alive. So in the Paris Agreement, countries committed to limiting global warming or increase in temperature rise to 2 degrees and make best efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. We're getting closer and closer to that target. So it was really important to show that we can make concerted efforts to really try to limit global temperature rise to just 1.5 degrees. As some countries that attended COP said, 2 degrees would be a death sentence. 1.5 degrees gives them some hope for their countries. But we will only achieve 1.5 degrees if we make concerted effort now. The fact that countries have said they want to keep this alive is a start, but so much needs to happen to ensure that we don't breach that 1.5 degree limit. So when we talk about the Paris rulebook, what does that mean? Well, the guidelines for how the Paris Agreement are delivered were still being negotiated following the Paris Agreement. Things like market mechanisms, transparency processes, and Article 6, which sets the framework for countries to exchange carbon emissions, have now been confirmed. And this should help with moving forward with emissions reduction globally. And for the first time ever, the language in the Glasgow Climate Pact included words on phasing down coal and phasing down the use of fossil fuels. This is incredibly important if we are to keep 1.5 degrees alive. When the UK took the COP26 mantle, in partnership with Italy 2 years ago, only 30% of the world was covered by net zero targets. This figure has now increased to over 90%. And at the same time, 154 parties have submitted new national targets, representing 80% of global emissions. There's still more to do, but countries have made an incredible start on this pathway. So the Glasgow Climate Pact is just one commitment. This was the focus of the negotiations at COP, and this is where the negotiators came together and agreed an outcome. On every day of the 2-week COP process, there was a different theme led by the UK presidency, and different commitments and announcements came out of those different thematic days. For example, as part of the World Leaders Summit on the first 2 days of COP, leaders committed to ending deforestation, reversing deforestation, and protecting forests, and looking at how they can manage land use more effectively. Around 40 leaders also committed to the Glasgow breakthroughs, an agenda that sees us scale up technology and make sure that we use that technology to make significant emissions reductions by 2030. There were also commitments on things like moving away from coal to clean energy, moving towards zero-emission vehicles, ending public financing of international fossil fuel projects, and many, many more. On the finance side of things as well, over 130 trillion of private finance is now committed to science-based net zero targets through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was led by the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. So what happens next? Well, whether or not COP26 was a success is critical on what happens next. Countries came together and showed their commitments and showed their ambition, but now the action needs to take place. Just like the topic for this session today, from discussions to action. And that action is up to all of us. It's up to governments, it's up to businesses, it's up to individuals. So within the Glasgow Climate Pact, countries agreed to revise their 2030 targets in line with 1.5 degrees within this year, and they will come back to revisit that this year. On financing, we're looking to enhance financing to help countries mitigate from and adapt to climate change, and in particular, doubling adaptation financing. And we need to enable the rapid net zero transition as soon as possible. We need to be moving financing away from fossil fuels to clean energy and to zero emission areas. We need to invest in these zero and low carbon projects. And businesses need to be assessing the risks of climate change and making appropriate business models to be able to divert away from or manage or adapt to the risks of climate change. And this includes setting science-based targets and pushing forward with emissions reductions across all sectors of their work, including their supply chains, so Scope 3 emissions. We also need businesses to call on governments to set the right policy and regulatory framework to enable the transition to net zero. And it makes sense to do this. This is the direction the world has to go in for all of our survival. Not being part of this game would be an absolute risk to business, to countries, and to human livelihoods. And how can we do this? The fundamental thing is that we need to collaborate. We need to work together to share solutions, to share expertise, to share learning. And the UK stands ready to work with Japan and others to achieve this. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Naomi Cowan at the British Embassy for that introduction. I think it sets the scene for today's discussion very nicely. So it's been a little while, a few months now, since COP ended. The buzz has perhaps subsided a little. It was all very exciting in the build-up and while the event was happening. So now perhaps we can look at it a little more objectively, the cold light of day, so to speak, and think about that question that Naomi mentioned in the video there. What happens next? What does this mean for businesses? And today I'm here with three very distinguished panelists to dig into that topic. So first of all, I have Alistair Dormer, Representative Executive Officer of Hitachi Limited. So welcome, Alistair. Right. Jennifer Rogers, General Counsel for Asia for Asurion. So lovely to have you here, Jennifer. And online, on the screen in the corner there, we have Aragon St. Charles, Global Head of ESG for Denton's law firm. So welcome, Aragon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. So before we dive into that question of what happens next and the how of the transition that needs to happen, let's start with looking at COP26. What did it deliver? Did it deliver on expectations? And I'd like to start with Alistair, because you were there on the ground. Hitachi, I believe, was one of the main partners for COP26 and the only major Japanese corporation there physically in Glasgow. So could you tell us a bit about your experience of that, what your expectations were and how that
Sure.
met?
Well, firstly, it was a really, really amazing event. And I think, now when we look back, we forget that in the build-up to COP, there was a lot of uncertainty. Was it going to be a face-to-face event? Was it going to be online? There were tensions around the world between, China and the US. So there were lots of speculation about was COP26 going to be a success or not. But actually, when it came together, it was an amazing energy in the event, because I think for the first time, what we had was huge engagement by not just governments and NGOs, but industry, financiers, and the whole business community. They're saying, okay, how can we help? How can we help really move this forward? Because as the world comes out of this pandemic, it's really, really important that we all work together to come up with the solutions that the world needs. So having been there, it was a really, really amazing achievement, because really this was the first face-to-face event for the world and global leaders for 2 years. So everybody was tremendously excited. I think the achievements that were made really exceeded expectations, because we did get those commitments, we did get people engaged, but now we're in the decade of delivery.
Right.
So now the hard work really, really starts. But we set, I think, a great foundation for the roadmap moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. And that's interesting, isn't it? How that being physically together really affects the dynamic and how people engage with something. And I think it would have been very, very different had it been entirely virtual.
I think so. I mean, people feed off people's enthusiasm and persuasiveness. So for Hitachi, it was an amazing event, because Hitachi is a major player in energy, in mobility, in industry, and in digital. So for us, the spectrum of potential partners, engaging with governments, engaging with financial partners, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to really have some really, really great conversations about how we can engage and help and form those partnerships to move forward. And we're working on a number of those really, really exciting opportunities now. So it was great for us.
Brilliant. Now, that's really encouraging to hear, so thank you for that. Jennifer, I'd like to sort of come to you now. So like the rest of us here in the room today, and perhaps most of the audience, if not all, you were looking from the outside in. What was your sort of overall impression of COP26? Did it deliver on what you expected? And was there anything surprising?
Yes, thank you for that question. And sitting on 3 Japanese listed company boards, it was kind of a more distant perspective. I think, though, what Alistair mentioned now was the fact that you had so much industry participation. And I think what you saw is a real acceleration in the commitment and the time frame to net zero emissions. I think if you looked up even to the drive to COP26, you had 2 years before, maybe 30% of the world signed up for those targets. You ended up with 90%. I think I serve on the board of Nissan Motor Corporation, and we, in anticipation of COP26, were the first Japanese car maker to sign up to commit to the race to zero. So I think, as mentioned in the introductory video, you had 8,000 companies already galvanized and committing to that race to zero. So from my perspective, it was that commitment relative to the broader industry. And I think you really brought together government, industry, but also financial institutions. What I think is the most exciting is the Glasgow Alliance to Net Zero. The fact that you have so much capital commitment now available to companies to actually deliver on those targets, because we all know, as Alistair mentioned, that this is the decade for delivery, and that's where you get to the real challenges. I think that from a Japanese company or being in Japan perspective, there's been some slow movement also around energy related, getting away from coal, those type of areas. So the move away from fossil fuels with the commitment to deforestation, and I think also while Japan wasn't a signatory, the sort of phasing out of coal is going to increase the stakeholder pressure now on companies, even in Japan and elsewhere, to accelerate getting out of non-clean energy. And I think that's where I really think there can be a lot of expectations of stakeholders that companies will now need to proactively really articulate their strategy around that.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, isn't it? So even though certain countries, and that includes Japan, didn't sign up to committing to phase down, I think, rather than phase out coal, sadly, there's still going to be that building pressure, as you say, and that's going to accelerate even more rapidly now in the light of this, with companies and countries making more and more ambitious pledges. So we're talking about race to zero, but I think that's also creating a race to the top in a way, in that who's going to go furthest on this, who's going to set the boldest ambition. So that sounds like it was a really positive outcome.
I think it can change the competitive playing field a bit in that way, and I think that's very positive.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Aragon, if I can come to you on this one now. So from your perspective, what did it look like from the outside looking in? And what were there any surprises or sort of interesting points that came up for you?
Thank you, Tova. I think the pragmatist in me agrees with what my colleagues on this panel have said, but it really depends on what lens you use to view the event. And so whilst there were some tremendous successes, for me, it seems in terms of a dedication to concrete action, COP26 disappointed in that it didn't go far enough. Despite a scientifically consistent message that we simply have to effect urgent action for a 1.5 degree pathway, research released during the conference showed that the plans countries have laid out so far for reducing emissions still add up to 2.4 degrees of temperature rise by the end of the century, a rise which will put over 1 billion of the most disadvantaged people in the world under extreme heat stress, double the extinction of plant species, and intensify the melting of sea ice in summer by 10 times, fueling up to 6 meters of sea level rise in vulnerable parts of the world. So a worry that I have, a concern, is that Glasgow was a great PR success. But I'm concerned that certain sectors certain governments seem to lack the necessary sense of urgency, and subsequently not enough was done to get real commitments to reduce emissions consistent with avoiding dangerous climate change in the decades to come.
Thank you, Aragon. And yes, I think that's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there are all these amazing commitments, pledges, promises coming out now. We're seeing, as Jennifer, you were mentioning, the companies setting net zero pledges, committing to finance. The rates have shot up, which is fantastic. But the big question is, are these going to be met? Are they going to be able to deliver on these commitments? So, Jennifer, if I can come to you first. I mean, you talk about sort of from a board perspective, you're sitting on the board of 3 Japanese companies. And from the board perspective, from the governance perspective there, what has changed?
Well, I think COP26 is definitely part of that acceleration of the preeminence or the importance of sustainability. I think COVID has also turbocharged the need at the board level to focus on sustainability as really one of your key topics. I think that I was talking to Alistair before this, but it's really an imperative now. It is not a nice to have. And that comes from a few different pressure points. One is, I think, from the stock exchange and the government. For example, you had a big change last year with the corporate governance code in Japan being introduced. You'd always had at the board level an ongoing obligation to talk about your strategy for sustainability to the mid to long term, but they also put in actual obligations to create and publish a sustainability policy and to disclose initiatives. And then in the diversity area, they went even farther and said, okay, we want you now to disclose for your management level voluntary targets around your female, non-Japanese, and mid-career hires. So you have the government actually starting to look at concrete ways you're going to need to disclose and holding you accountable. But really you have the institutional and the global institutional investors pressurizing you. I think in Japan we've had the luxury of less pressure from individual investors. But I think what you see now with, there was a recent study by Edelman in association with the National Association of Corporate Directors in the US, and 97% of investors say they're going to engage with executive management and the board on business activities related to ESG. In addition to that, you had BlackRock, Larry Fink, and their pressure saying that on climate change and diversity, they are now actually going to hold boards accountable and vote appropriately. So you're really having the level of board conversation, not only at the strategy, but you're having to drill down on diversity, et cetera, into how are you meeting the targets. And that leads to the other, I think, critical change that is occurring in all major companies, is that your internal organization has had to adapt and change. You have to create these holistic sustainability committees cutting across product, production, and HR, bring in sustainability experts to really make sure that you're setting targets, but that you're following the regulations around that, you're monitoring them, so that you can accurately disclose that to meet those expectations. So for me, I think the governance and the pressure on boards, as well as the accountability, has dramatically changed, and I think COP26 was sort of part of that acceleration. So I do think that as a director now, you not only have to be on top of this topic, but I think if you are in the sustainability area, people are going to be actively looking for directors with that specialized knowledge.
Can I just add a point on that? I mean, I absolutely agree with everything you said. But the other really interesting thing is that from my point of view, this is the first time that we've actually got alignment between our customers, our investors, but also our young generation.
It's true.
Now, we're in a race for talent. In Japan, we've got a declining population. We've got a real challenge about how do we attract the brightest minds in order to compete globally. And the young generation have a voice. And they want to work for a company that's doing the right thing. They don't want to work for companies that are seen to not be doing the right thing. So it's part of their choice. So for companies to actually be doing the right thing from an ESG point of view, yes, we focus on our investors, yes, we focus on our customers, but equally, we've got to look after our people. So, to me, it's a kind of perfect alignment from outside, inside, and focused on the market.
And I just think, from the governance, one of the ways you can motivate as a board that change in behavior and also get that recruitment is I sit on the compensation committee for one of my boards, and we have actually linked compensation for executives and for the long term for stock to actually ESG imperatives, carbon neutrality, as well as human rights. So you're really seeing a game changer, and I think you're absolutely right that that's what you need to also focus on, is that the young people and the people that want to work for a socially responsible company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We linked our executive pay to ESG targets last year, and it did change the dial.
Yes,
I mean,
I can imagine.
our business leaders suddenly woke up and said, okay,
How do we
this
do
is really
this?
important.
Yep.
How are we delivering on this? So, yeah.
Yes, I think that's a brilliant point and something very close to my heart. I work on the people side of sustainability transformation. So this is something we talk about a lot. What are the enablers within organizations? Where are the leverage points that you can use to get people to make those longer term behavioral changes? So I absolutely agree, and tying it to compensation is a surefire way usually to get people's attention on that. Aragon, I know for you, in your previous role at Hogan Lovells, you were very much sort of deeply involved in the operational side of implementing on sustainability strategies. Do you want to talk about this from the operations perspective? How can companies begin to make these massive shifts to realize these big commitments that we're hearing about?
Thank you, Toby. And it builds very much on what Alistair and Jennifer have just mentioned. It starts at the very top, and you need to have this driven at the executive board level. And without that kind of support, it makes it extremely difficult for institutional change to happen. You have got a wellspring of smart people in every company who are passionate about this topic, and you need to give them a means of enabling activity in this area. So we tend to look at it through the lens of risks and opportunities, and there are, of course, a great many. To name a couple, for many companies, as you know, a significant proportion of their carbon emissions will in fact be within scope 3 and primarily within their supply chains. And so as more and more global companies are making net zero commitments, they are necessarily committing to clean up their own supply chains and broader value chains, of course. So suppliers are therefore finding themselves being asked to be transparent about their own carbon emissions, to ensure that they're being reported accurately, and as part of their own commitments to net zero, are putting in place effective strategies to reduce their emissions and to demonstrate progress against the targets. And so the risk for many companies is that if they're not already advanced on this journey, then they could be faced with simply losing business unless they make radical, transformational, and potentially very costly change. There's also the risk that companies may be cut off from investment funding if they cannot meet enhanced ESG requirements from the financial markets, or face increased stakeholder pressure from activist investors or just concerned shareholders. However, I think within that also lies tremendous opportunity to reevaluate how businesses are run, to develop innovative new product lines, to develop new markets, new consumers, and all of these can be helpful to manage, what was commonly called the triple bottom line: the people, planet, and profit. Profit is not a dirty word. Companies are run to make profit, and if we can do that with a purpose, and that alludes to some of the points my colleagues on the panel have already made. Profit with some kind of purpose is important for people these days, for employees, for consumers, for shareholders, stakeholders, and so forth. So I think that, something like, so I work for Denton's, I think the largest law firm in the world, and for our lawyers, as clients are racing to strengthen their governance on ESG related matters and to future-proof their businesses, as we see enhanced regulatory regimes across the world, legal challenges to existing ways of doing business and so forth, there are tremendous opportunities for us as a law firm to help our clients with those issues. And so I think embedded within the risks are the opportunities as well. And so companies need to focus on both of those so that they can drive forward what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think it's important to realize that big and scary as it is, looking at the challenges we're facing, there are positives here as well. There are opportunities to reinvent how we're doing things and do that in a much better way and a much more equitable way. So I'd like to pick up on one point that Aragon was just sort of alluding to there, which is collaboration between, within the supply chain. And Naomi Cowan mentioned in her video as well, talking about, sort of looking at scope 3 right down through the value chain. For any of these large organizations, that's really where a lot of the impact is. So how can a large organization effectively collaborate, work with those smaller entities within its value chain, whether that's the companies or the communities that it's working with NGOs? What does effective collaboration look like? So, Alistair, perhaps I could start with you on that one.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's a really, really good point. And it's going to flow all the way from the customer all the way back to the smallest supplier. So, a number of our major clients that we're working with have turned around and said, look, we're only going to do business with companies that are net zero. By 2025 or by 2030 or whatever the target they've set. And it's not necessarily uniform. And we woke up to this, quite a while ago, and analysed our entire supply chain. So you can't hit 30,000 suppliers in Japan in one go. So we sort of took 70% by value is really our top sort of 2,000 suppliers. So we went to all of them and said, first question, hey, what are you doing? What is your plan? This is what we need to see. This is what we want to see. And a lot of those companies are listed companies, so they're already getting the same pressure that we're getting. So there is alignment there. The key concern is really how do you work with the SMEs as you get further down the value chain? And that is a big concern, particularly in Japan, because there is a very, very wide and vast SME community. But we believe it's up to companies like Hitachi, the big major companies, like Nissan or Kawasaki or whoever it is. What we need to do is work with them to say, okay, this is how we can help you.
Yeah.
So, for example, we are developing a set of tools at the moment which will visualize your energy consumption. And you can connect through blockchain to renewable energy. So you can provide certification to your customer that that particular machine, if you can't afford to do the whole factory, that machine is using renewable energy. And therefore that machine is actually operating in a carbon efficient way.
Yeah.
So there's a step-by-step approach. We're not there yet. I mean, let's be fair, there's still a long way to go on this. But the direction is there, the momentum is there. And for any of the small companies out there that are maybe listening to this, if you don't think it applies to you, you are mistaken. And in order for the long-term survival of your business, you really need to take this seriously. And you really need to think about the investments you need to make. Because if you make the investments early, there is a potential for you to really, really win.
Right.
Because you will be ahead of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And to flip that around, if you're not getting deeply involved in understanding your impact and doing something about it, then the risks of the inaction are also tremendous as well. So.
Indeed.
Yeah, okay. Jennifer, to come to you on that, working with, you work with a lot of different companies. How are you seeing the engagement, or how are boards considering this, the need to engage with, say, SMEs or other entities as well, such as NGOs or educational research facilities? What are you seeing happening there?
I think at the board level, the really important focus, I think that the pandemic has really put the supply chain weaknesses under a microscope. Yes. And I think that, because of that, there's been a lot of focus, rightly so. I think the semiconductor problem in particular, as well as getting your resources, getting your energy, getting your parts, has been a huge challenge. I think it's created, though, further to what Alistair and Aragon have said, opportunities relative to re-looking at who you're engaging with, your suppliers, and how you can support them. Because it goes to overall, if they're not doing the compliance and the due diligence around things like the UK Anti-Slavery Act, you're going to have weaknesses, obviously, then in your compliance. So there's a lot more tracking and discussion about the supply chain, the suppliers that you're choosing, how you're monitoring them, and also how you're working much more interactively with them, because the centralization of the supply chain is now a thing of the past. I think diversity of your supply chain now is critical, which means you have more exposure, probably to smaller players. And I think because each industry is quite different, and the type of players you need to engage with can vary. At the board level, it's more you have to ask about how is your supply chain operating, how are you monitoring it. I think further to what Alistair said, coming up with these kind of solutions, but also as you really look closely at it and you reduce your carbon emissions, you can get cost savings. There's a lot of competitive, I think, advantages then to really putting your supply chain under scrutiny that didn't exist before. I think there needs to be probably even a greater focus on your partnerships and how you're engaging on the Scope 3 elements. And I think that's the next challenge for boards. I think Alistair is also head of ESG. I don't know how much granularity you get at the board level, but certainly I'm always asking questions about the supply chain, because you have the sense on so many levels as a board member that that's the weakest link in your compliance.
That's interesting, isn't it? I worked on a project last year with a large Japanese company in the food and beverage industry, and that was, I think, one of the most challenging issues we faced, to get them to understand the importance and value of engaging in conversations with, for example, Conservation International or NGOs, and to look at the really thorny, difficult issues right down at the sort of bottom of their supply chain, and to understand why they needed to take action on this, even though it was going to be costly and a little sort of inconvenient in the beginning. It takes time and effort to go out and engage and to bring these people into the conversation. But it is, as you say, so important to start doing that and to recognize the potential risks if that is not happening further down the line.
It's another key criteria for how you set up your business.
Right.
I think that the direction of travel maybe pre-pandemic was drive for cost and quality, lowest cost, volume. And what the pandemic has shown us is that you really need resilience in your supply chain. Exactly. And therefore you need to be able to be local where you need to be local, some global. But then it's not just a pandemic. When you get these sort of trade issues between the China and the US or whatever, how are you managing that risk? Right. How are you facing your markets with the potential risks of maybe being excluded because of your supply chain? Yeah. So ESG is as important a risk in the supply chain as these other issues of cost. Yeah. So, yeah, the world's changed, for sure.
It has, and I think that's a positive. Jennifer, you?
Yeah, no, I think that territorial issues, the localization of the supply chain now, trying to get your goods from China, it can't go to the US. A lot of the supply chain logistics now have forced you to have more local focus.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It is a different world we're dealing with, isn't it, very much?
Sure.
Aragon, if I can come back to you, we've been talking a lot about sort of very sort of high-level discussions around sort of how a board's seeing this, how a board's reacting to this. I know you have a lot of experience with working internally with the organisation to deal with, how do you get people at different levels within the organisation engaged and really taking action on this? Could you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so my experience is within a professional services organisation. And some of the challenges there will be different to the challenges from a manufacturing organisation, for example. But I think that engaging all of your people within the organisation is extremely important. Everyone needs to know what is important to the firm, what is the direction the firm is taking, and be assured that it is an ESG-focused direction. Operationally, I think that ESG, environmental sustainability, needs to be embedded within operations. It needs to be not something that an external CSR-focused person is insisting the company do. It should be something that operational leaders are embedding as part of their normal course of doing business. So I have always campaigned for ESG to be within operations. It shouldn't be within CSR or within charitable. Those areas have tremendous value to the firm. But when we look at how we do business, the marketing teams should be looking at approaches that reduce their emissions. IT teams should be looking at what they do to reduce emissions. And all of these teams should be working in concert, and they should be working towards some global plan that is defined, that is hopefully set with something like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and that is measurable and is reported through something like CDP so that progress can be properly measured. So those are the types of things I think that are really important for companies to develop when they start looking at an ESG approach, just to make sure it's done systematically and in a sustainable fashion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just pick up on a point there?
Yeah.
I mean, it was very, very interesting what you said, and also picking up on something that Jennifer said earlier about sort of purpose-led management or the purpose of a company. And I picked up this role 18 months ago within Hitachi, and I'm a businessman. I'm not an environmental expert, but the key area for me that was really, really fascinating was how we could actually engage with our people, because Hitachi is a huge company, and people in Japan will have some touch point somewhere, whether it's air conditioning, whether it's a TV or a washing machine, but maybe they don't know that Hitachi is the number one player in global energy distribution and transmission. We're a huge player in mobility, in railways, but also in automotive parts. We're a big player in industry. We're a massive player in digital. When you sort of condense that down and you say to the folks in the organisation, do you realise we are the number one company connecting the wind farms in the North Sea to Scotland. So we are providing that renewable energy for the United Kingdom. So our purpose is the decarbonisation of the United Kingdom. And not just the United Kingdom, we're linking Norway to Europe, we're linking North Africa to Europe, the US, Canada down to California, but then in the mobility side about how we decarbonise mobility, how we work with companies to transition from conventional buses to electric buses. the work we're doing with industry, the digital enablers we're putting in place. Suddenly you turn to your workforce, all 350,000 of them, and say, hey, the purpose of Hitachi is about ESG and is about sustainability of the planet.
Yeah.
And it's about that transition in energy, mobility, industry, and the enablers that we can bring. And then folks start getting excited about, actually, that is what Hitachi's for.
Yeah.
That's the purpose. So I'm not just the energy bit or the mobility bit or the industry bit or something else. Actually, I work for a corporation that's doing the right thing for the planet and for the people. So for me, that is just the biggest kick in terms of employee engagement, of how we can get that message out. So yeah, sorry, I've probably gone slightly off track.
Can
But
see you're very
just-
passionate about this.
No, it is something that
Rightly so.
does, as I mentioned before, it connects all parts of the organisation, and it isn't an external thing looking in; it's within.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really is key, isn't it? Getting people's heart captured. Why are we doing this? That, you know, humans, we can look at the systems in companies, and I think that's incredibly important. We need to look at the processes, the governance, and every aspect of that, how we're tracking, measuring, etc. But at the end of the day, this is people delivering on these strategies, on these goals, people meeting those KPIs. And if they don't know, and if they're not really passionately engaged with why they're doing it, it's going to be a very hard sell to get them to change. So I think, yeah, absolutely agree with you on that one. Jennifer, I can see you look like you're agreeing there. Would that be your experience as well?
I think it's really important, just to further to what both panelists have said now, to, you know, how do you operationalize the ESG? I mean, now, for me, it's a real risk management challenge, because you've got diversity in HR targets, you've got, you know, regulatory emissions, penalties, CAFE, you know, different countries having those, some carbon trading you might be offsetting. Then at the other end, you've got, you know, the need to produce less emitting of vehicles or ships or whatever if you're in the manufacturing field. So for me, you know, your ESG has to be end-to-end from a process organization, but also from a commitment. If you don't get a bottoms-up approach as well as a top-down, you will, I think, not succeed in really delivering on what you're going to have to do in the next 5 to 10 years. I think the acceleration of those expectations with stakeholders, and then your ability to disclose how you're doing it across the organization, has ratcheted up so much. It's a real paradigm shift that has to happen, as you know, Alistair said, from an organizational perspective. And how to harness that, I think, is still something everybody's working on. But at the sustainability committees, even when you're bringing together stakeholders, these are all now run by a representative director of the board, or they're by the president. You certainly have now at least the reporting element going up to senior management that does show that top commitment. But you still have to get that engagement at the employee level. And I think that's where, you know, hopefully too, as you bring in more diverse talent, you have a mind shift with the younger people also that are really galvanized towards that social responsibility, doing the right thing. And I think that also will help with that tipping to a more ESG-oriented organization.
Absolutely, yeah. Aragon, yes?
Toby, could I pick up 2 points that were said by both Alistair and then Jennifer? Supply chains, you talked a bit about the supply chains. I mean, that could be a topic, a 2-3 hour topic in and of itself. But one thing that's interesting about the supply chain is it's internally, when some people maybe don't understand the need for action, when you talk to them about how supply chain issues are going to affect their business, it can have a huge impact. So again, I work for a law firm, and some partners may say, well, look, is ESG important to me, to my practice? Is this going to affect me? Especially when we're saying, look, we need to invest into getting better at our own emissions and reduction schemes and so forth. And some partners may say, how is this going to affect me? And something I found, certainly at my last firm, was we started to have big clients, and it tends to start with the biggest global clients, saying, if you don't meet these standards yourselves within the next 2 to 3 years, you will not be working for us. And some of them were as blunt as that. So we had 3 in particular that were absolutely clear. We have made a commitment. We need you to make a commitment. And if you don't make it and show progress within the next 2 to 3 years, they asked us to report by a certain standard and a target to be met, we would be dropped. Now, often those communications are coming from the office of the CEO or global procurement. It's not coming through the general counsels of those companies. And so when we go to the partner and say, you realize you're going to lose your client in 2 to 3 years if you don't actually support this and if we don't do better, and they're completely shocked. And so I think that's an important part of that supply chain issue as well, is helping executives understand, if they don't quite understand, that it's going to affect the business materially and with significant financial, revenue drops if they don't do it properly. So that was sort of one point that came up as Alistair was speaking. And the second point I've forgotten. I'll come back to it if I recall it.
Okay, thank you, Aragon. So I'm very conscious that time is racing by very quickly. So I'd like to start looking at some of the questions that are coming in now. We've got quite a few coming in here. And actually, just sort of related to that point, I think, that you were making, Aragon, about how do you make people understand how important this is if they don't necessarily get that. We have a question for Jennifer from Justin Conley, who says, you mentioned that you sit on 3 Japanese listed boards. How many sustainability experts do you have on those boards? I mean, are there a lot of them there, or?
This is a very timely topic, I think, because you have to create a skill matrix too that talks about, what do your directors bring to it. I think you could safely say, though, if you're on a board now, or if you're in any company, you have to have a certain level of ESG knowledge. Mm-hmm. I think there's gradations of it, but I don't think there's been a proactive search done for ESG experts yet at the board level. I think that's coming. I think what you found is you've had HR, talented people that might come in and look at your human resources and your diversity, but it's been much more siloed. And I think the problem that you have, frankly, with ESG is it's so broad. Sustainability, you talk about emissions, you talk about diversity, you talk about supply chain. You have to cut your internal, emissions from what you produce, but then the goods that you're selling need to be, eco-friendly. So I think that there's so many ways you could have expertise in the ESG area that while I do think there is a market for sustainability officers who help you harness all of that knowledge and talent, you still have to target for each industry, I think, what area you need. And I think the thing is then, do you get a digital expert or somebody from technology or an ESG sustainability officer? So, you're going to have to make some trade-offs, but it's an excellent point and something that is going to be, I think, the new focus for companies that are looking to fill new board positions. I think the first one is still probably diversity in Japan because it's been lacking, but I think it's an excellent point, but not something yet that you've seen, I think, materialize, but I think watch this space.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Just scrolling through here, we've got a lot of questions coming in, which is great. Let me see. So we have another question around, again, relating to boards that perhaps might come to you first, Alistair, there. From Roland Thompson, can the panelists comment on how corporate boards integrate ESG and COP26 commitments into enterprise risk management reports and internal auditing processes? So we've spoken a little bit. I think we've touched upon that, but... Yeah,
okay. I mean, that is a huge topic in its own right. And one thing that's got to happen, and this was a big discussion actually at COP26, was, how do we measure in a consistent way? And And I think what is going to happen, I believe, by within the next 2 to 3 years, is that the standards will start to converge. Because at the moment you've got CDP, MSCI, you've got all these different, and there are a huge amount of work to do every year for your sustainability report. What we as industry have been asking for is, we all have international accounting standards, IFRS. What we would like is an international standard for sustainability. So please evaluate us in a consistent way and tell us how you're going to evaluate us.
Yeah.
And then we can report in a consistent way. And I think that is a fundamental milestone on the way to achieving this, because then everybody can see, okay, what is the risk? What are the gaps? From an internal point of view, how do you measure? How do you audit your organization so that you're all on the same standard? Yeah. So that's a fundamental. I mean, don't wait for that, because there's lots of things that you can be doing in the meantime, and there are lots of good organizations out there that you can talk to. Yeah. But ultimately, we do need that in order to be reassured that we're all doing the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, that's something I think which is a priority now across industries, across geographies, really finding out how do we get consistent measurement and reporting on this. And I think a lot of the questions are coming in are actually related to that point. Comment from Paul Betty that ESG is so big, just as you were saying, it basically now covers everything a company does. So would it make sense, or is it practical to have a top priority on addressing climate change and emissions? Should that be the number one priority? So Jennifer, you were talking about how gender is perhaps the biggest issue that Japanese companies are talking about at the moment because of the lag against the global standards. So, I mean, how do we go about prioritizing this? So just last comments maybe before we wrap this up.
Well, I think that climate change is absolutely essential, and I think being part of manufacturer trading companies, how you do it in your investment, approach by your internal carbon pricing and looking at the cost benefits, or how you do it when you're at your production facilities with an intelligent factory, it really varies. But I think why diversity is so key is if you're looking at a lot of what's going to happen with climate change is innovation and technology.
Yeah.
A lot of the assumptions around even electric vehicles are that, you're going to have government support at the beginning, but your battery technology, everything has to improve in leaps and bounds. So I think when you think about innovation, diversity drives innovation, and with the corporate governance code, the number of independent directors, the tracking of female, non-Japanese hires now, I think you're really getting a focus on this kind of the homogeneity of, in particular, Japanese society groupthink. You really need to have proactive diversity as well as climate change. I thought it was very interesting that BlackRock is focused on those two as their accountability targets, probably because they're more measurable.
Yeah.
But I do think that showing that you're committed to diversity, I think, has that overall message that you are trying to change the behavior in your organization. Because what I say is you can't just bring in diverse individuals. You have to have that inclusive environment. There's a behavior change.
Yeah.
You have to have the transparency of your HR policies. You have to build in that performance culture that then people know what their job is. So it doesn't matter, you're evaluating the job performance and not how that individual is operating, or how that individual looks per se, or their background. So I think that you're right. I think diversity is a critical element in addition to climate change and should be a priority, especially at Japanese companies. And the easiest focus is women. You have this huge talent of Japanese women that haven't been utilized. So it's an easy answer. But getting the age diversity, getting the non-Japanese, bringing in the mid-hires, getting best practice information of people that haven't grown up in your organization, especially at large companies, I think is critical. So for me, diversity used in that sense can really compel you to help with all of your other ESG targets, especially in that innovation and that discomfort that diversity brings leads to different and better ideas.
Absolutely, and I think that highlights very clearly how interconnected and interdependent these issues are. You can't just pick one and focus on that. You've really got to take a holistic view. So just to wrap up, Aragon, any final comments from you? We've covered a broad range of things and we're right up against the clock or slightly over it now. Any final comments before we leave?
I think I would say to any businesses looking at this is that it can look daunting. There is so much to be done and it can look intimidating, but just be methodical in your approach. Make sure you have strong employee engagement, and change may not be drastic and it may not happen overnight, but small, sustained, incremental changes can bring about the reduction in emissions that we need. And so just keep doing those small things. If you can do an amazing, industry-changing thing, that's fantastic. But for many, that's not possible. But just make a start. Make it consistent. Embed it within your operations. So your IT people, they know their market better than I do. HR people know their market better than I do. But just embed that systematic change and just keep doing it bit by bit, and you should make your targets.
Brilliant. Thank you
There's
very
hope.
much. Well, there we go. There's the answer, apparently. So thank you very much. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to cover all of the questions, but please do engage with the BCCJ on this. We would love to continue the conversation with all of our members within the Japan and beyond. And thank you very much, Alistair, Jennifer, Aragon, for your time today and your insights. That was a really interesting and enjoyable discussion from my perspective. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Lola. Thank you.
Thank you for having
Thanks,
us.
everybody.